Hey everyone, Harold Fisher here, WHUR News, with a look at the constantly moving story regarding the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis, Minnesota. My guest today is Glenn Ivey Esquire. He is a partner at Ivey and Levittown. He is also a former Prince George's County State's Attorney. Another word for that, of course, is Chief Prosecutor. He was the former Chief Prosecutor in Prince George's County in Maryland, in Prince George's County, Maryland. Glenn, thank you so much for joining the program. I appreciate you taking the time to talk to us.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Let's go right into this. You know, after days of protests and there have been demands for justice, today the Hennepin County prosecutor in the state of Minnesota announced that an arrest was made in the killing of George Floyd. The former police officer Derek Chauvin was charged with third-degree murder, and I need to talk to you about the charges. What do they mean? How will this case move forward? First of all, talk to me a little bit about your reaction to what has happened today.
Well, I thought it was interesting that the charges came this fast. I think it's unusual, and usually in police shooting cases or police excessive force cases for an indictment or a charge to be returned this quickly. But I saw the press conference that the chief prosecutor gave, and basically he said that because of the strength of the videos and some of the other information that had come in, they felt that they were able to move forward with charges today.
Mm-hmm. Also, there was a manslaughter charge that was added to this case. Talk to me specifically about the charges. First of all, third-degree murder, and then manslaughter, and why not first-degree murder? Why not second-degree murder? Kind of break it down for us.
Sure. First-degree murder is, intentional murder, essentially malice aforethought in most jurisdictions. Police officers are almost never charged with first-degree murder for doing police work, even if they use excessive force as extreme here. But that's laying in wait to kill. That's like hitman kind of charges or something along those lines. Second-degree murder, I think, was a closer call. Second-degree murder and third-degree murder are not too different in Minnesota. But one thing that might be instructive here was exactly a year ago today, or this month, this same prosecutor's office won a conviction against another police officer for killing a woman in Minnesota. They had brought second-degree murder charges and third-degree murder charges. That jury rejected the second-degree charges and came back with third-degree. So that might have been part of the thinking too. But the other thing to keep in mind is they haven't announced final charges yet. These are just the initial charges brought by the prosecutors. So depending on what other evidence shows up, they might decide to go forward with second-degree murder.
What about the manslaughter charge?
We'll have to see.
What does the manslaughter charge mean?
Manslaughter is usually it's a drop-down charge. Usually there's some sort of provocation or something that could be argued was somehow mitigating and that led to the killing. Frankly, I think it's just a backup charge here. I don't really see what the mitigation would be. The videos that we've seen, not only with the officer with his neck on Mr. Floyd's neck, his knee on Mr. Floyd's neck, but the video leading up to that, where he's handcuffed and seeming to be cooperative and just walking in the direction the officer's leading him in, doesn't seem to suggest any kind of struggle or any kind of resistance or any kind of fight, which might be the sort of scenario that would lead you or a jury to think that manslaughter might be a more appropriate charge. So I don't think that the manslaughter charge is going to be the one that carries the day. I think it's going to be a question of whether it ends up staying with only third-degree murder or whether it move up to a second-degree murder charge as well.
Let's talk a little bit about the other three officers. There was a video that was released today that showed at least two other officers kneeling on Mr. Floyd's back while Officer Chauvin had his knee on his neck. Why are we still not seeing arrests or charges filed against those at least two other officers and indeed the other three?
Well, I think there's a couple things in play on this. Number one, again, they haven't announced final charges yet, so they still might bring charges against the other three. Number two, I don't think they've gotten the final report back from the medical examiner. I think they got a preliminary report, and they thought that based on the video, that was sufficient to go forward with charging Officer Chauvin. But for the others, you're going to, depending on what charge you bring, you're going to need to show that they committed acts that led to the death, and that might not be the case. I'm assuming at this point, not having seen the medical preliminary report, that there was some sort of maybe break in a neck bone or something that led to asphyxiation based on that. The prosecutors are going to need to link the actions of the other officers directly to the death, if possible. And then finally, I think one of the things they ran into, and this is frequently true in police cases, it's difficult to get statements from other officers sometimes about what they know, what these officers said to colleagues immediately afterwards. In the case from last year, for example, this is when Officer Noor was convicted. It turned out that there'd been a meeting of 20 of the officers in trying to make a decision about whether they were even going to cooperate with the investigation or not. And that significantly delayed the prosecution in that case, in addition to not also having video like you have here. So you want to see if you can gather as many statements as possible. If you've got information about the other three saying things like, why they did it or things that implicate them or show guilt, you definitely want to know that you can get those statements. And then the last thing, and I'm not exactly sure about this, but most jurisdictions don't have grand juries sitting right now because of the COVID outbreak. You can't put a group of more than 10 people in a room together without social distancing. Most grand juries are in the neighborhood of 23 people. So that might also be a delay. So in a scenario where you might have been taking witnesses to the grand jury already to have them give statements, they might not be able to do that right now because of the COVID issue.
Well, you speak to a really interesting issue, and I really need you to talk to me, certainly from the prospect of a prosecutor, because the Hennepin County District Attorney said that this has happened quickly. The thing that a lot of people are taking issue with is George Floyd was killed on Monday.
Right.
If I had done it, being a regular citizen, and it was just me, no assistance from anyone else, and my knee was on a man's neck, and there was video, and I'm not a lawyer, so help me with this.
Sure.
But I believe that if I were at home, that it's very likely that if George Floyd died on Monday night, I would have been arrested and charged just as quickly as the officers were fired. Is that accurate?
No, not really, with respect to police officers and police prosecutions.
That's the difference.
Yeah, I mean, there's several big differences. One is that police officers are given a limited immunity to use violence as part of their jobs, including deadly force or lethal violence. And so the fact that they use it, unlike a regular citizen, where there's sort of a burden of proof that goes the other way. If you're a regular citizen and you do something that leads to somebody's death, you need to have a defense because you don't have any kind of limited immunity for what you did. So the guys that the former guys that ran down the young man, the jogger, earlier this month, they didn't have limited immunity. I think it's a big question as to why they didn't get arrested quicker. I think there were cover-up issues that had an impact there. But
Yeah, that
I
was
think
going to
that'd
say
be.
they apparently had cover-up immunity,
Oh
which
yeah,
seems to have
absolutely.
lasted considerably longer than the limited immunity that has been afforded the officer in Minneapolis. But please continue.
No, no, I think that's right. I mean, one of the older guy had been an investigator for one of the prosecutor's offices, and I think had police experience as well. So they clearly closed ranks around him, like they frequently do with other police officers, and that's what slowed it down. But when you've got a limited immunity case, it makes it harder to prosecute it and prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, especially when you're bringing these kinds of charges. And so so the one that Hennepin County did last year that resulted in a conviction, and that officer was sentenced to 12, I think over 12 years in jail, and he was convicted of second-degree murder. I always try and tell people that the most important thing is not whether he gets arrested immediately and goes to jail, but whether he goes to jail after it's all over. Because if you rush this and you do it too quick and you make mistakes, these police officers always get experienced defense attorneys who can attack the case, and if they find a weakness, you could end up having an acquittal. And Lord knows we've seen plenty of those. So I think it's important to make sure you take your time and do it right, so that you get the conviction and that there's a accountability at the end of it.
Obviously, you are not a part of this case, but like all of us, we've been doing, our own observations. One of the things that did come out today, based on the charging documents, and I took these notes. According to the charging documents, Officer Chauvin had his knee on the neck of Mr. Floyd for a total of 8 minutes and 46 seconds, and for 2 minutes and 53 seconds after he ceased to be responsive. So we're talking almost 9 minutes total, and almost 3 minutes where Mr. Floyd had ceased crying out or squirming.
Right.
What does that tell you?
Well, I think it's very powerful evidence of why this looks like a second-degree murder case. And then I'll add an additional fact, I think. I thought that in the mid-90s, most police jurisdictions had banned chokeholds and these kinds of holds where somebody's chest is pressed down to the ground or their neck, precisely because of the risks of asphyxiation and death. So I thought that was decades old, that police departments had stopped teaching officers to do this, and in fact, had started teaching them not to do it. So one of the things you use to try and prove that an officer acted wrongly is to code to, they call them general orders. There's sort of protocols that police departments have about what police can and cannot do under certain circumstances. And so my thinking is, you'd think that the police department there would have banned those kinds of moves because they're so dangerous. And then secondly, the fact that he pinned him down in this dangerous way for that length of time, even though he hadn't been resisting. At least the video I saw, I never saw any kind of resistance at all, even when he was dying. To me, that sort of screams out for this is clearly excessive force. Officer didn't need to do this to maintain control. His life wasn't at risk. He didn't need to do it because the guy was struggling and he wanted to not allow himself to be put at risk. He just did it. I gotta say too, the officer's demeanor while he's doing this, at least some for the videos, he just seems like he's waiting in line at the grocery store or something. I mean, he's clearly not scared. He's clearly not upset. He's clearly not, he can't say the adrenaline was pumping and he lost himself. He looks calm, cool as a cucumber out there, and more than comfortable killing this man in this way.
Mm-hmm. Well, and one other thing too that came from the charging documents, and this is preliminary autopsy information, was that Mr. Floyd did not die from asphyxiation or any broken bones, but from underlying pre-existing health conditions that were exacerbated by this encounter, this detention with police. That's preliminarily what we're hearing now. Obviously, as you said, there's going to be a more detailed examination of the cause of death. But that seems to me that's 50%. That was it. 50% of one half dozen. Have six of one, half dozen of the other. And where if he hadn't had this encounter with police, that he may have lived, but the actual encounter didn't kill him. That's just weird to me.
Well, I think that's an excellent point. It's called causation, and it'll be, depending on how the final report comes out from the medical examiner, and the defense team for the officers may get their own medical examiner to conduct an autopsy and review. That sounds like one of the things they're going to attack if this goes to trial, and I'm assuming it will. They'll argue that the officer's actions were not the cause of death, that he died for some other reason. I guess we'll have to wait and see what the other issues were. Typically in these kinds of scenarios, prosecutors conclude and argue to the jury that but for the actions of this individual, in this case the police officer, he wouldn't have died despite the pre-existing conditions. But depending on what they are, it could be a big issue at trial.
Glenn Ivey, former Prince George's County State's attorney, I appreciate your time. Of course, we will talk to you again tonight on a very special edition of The Daily Drum, starting at 7 on WHUR and Sirius XM, channel 141, A Killing in Minneapolis. I really appreciate your time. Talk to you later, and we certainly welcome our listeners to join us and really pay attention and participate in this discussion. This is truly a watershed moment, not only for 2020, but I would argue in criminal justice history. So again, we'll see you tonight at 7. Thank you so much, Glenn.
Thank you.
All right. I'll see you on the radio tonight.